When Keanu Reeves rushed into the veterinary clinic with an injured rescue dog in his arms, his eyes were shining with desperation. "Please, it's an emergency. We need your help." But the veterinarian looked him up and down with a mocking glance, a sneer forming on his lips. "If you don't have money, you have no business here. Get out." Everyone in the clinic looked at Keanu's messy hair and casual clothes, thinking he was just another penniless homeless person. No one knew that history was being made in that moment, because this so-called bum was actually one of Hollywood's biggest stars. And very soon, this arrogant veterinarian would learn that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Hey, you! You're listening to this story right now, and it seems like you're enjoying it. But I noticed you still haven't subscribed. This makes me a little sad. Come on, leave a like and subscribe, and let's spread Keanu Reeves' life lessons to millions. Because this story is just for you. Now, let's get into the story. The rain droplets hit the streets rapidly. In the darkness of the night, the city, nearly empty, was silent. But that silence was broken by the sound of footsteps. Keanu Reeves was running toward a veterinary clinic, carrying a weak, trembling dog in his arms. His breath was uneven, his steps resolute. The dog's fragile chest was rising and falling rapidly, weakly. Time was running out. He opened the door quickly and rushed inside. Water was dripping from him, but he didn't care. The only thing that mattered right now was that the life in his arms survived. "Please, it's an emergency. We need your help." A few people were sitting inside the clinic. They turned their heads. They scrutinized Keanu. He was soaked from the rain, tired, his messy hair sticking to his face. The panic in his eyes told everything. But the veterinarian glanced at him, then took a sip from his coffee and shook his head. "If you don't have money, you don't belong here. Get out." Keanu's breath caught. Had he heard that wrong? "This dog is dying. Please, I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice trembling. But the vet didn't take a step. He was cold and indifferent. "We're not doing charity work here. Don't you understand?" Silence. A few people in the waiting room looked at Keanu, mocking smiles, condescending looks. "Definitely just a penniless homeless guy," one whispered. "People act like angels, but when the bill comes, they disappear," another said, laughing. Keanu looked at the dog's chest, rapidly rising and falling. Time was running out, but no one cared. Sadly, they didn't realize they were making history, because they were facing Keanu Reeves, and this arrogant veterinarian would soon learn the painful lesson of his mistake. Keanu tightened his grip on the dog in his arms. His breath had become irregular. A storm was raging inside him, but there was not a hint of anger on his face. Only a deep silence. The people in the clinic were still watching him. Condescending smiles, murmurs. "He's definitely some kind of fraud. He'll get help and then won't pay," one said quietly. "Why would someone without money adopt an animal?" asked another. The words hung in the air. But do you know what the worst part was? No one was looking at the poor animal. They were all busy judging Keanu. Keanu Reeves's eyes locked with the veterinarian's. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. "This animal is dying," Keanu said, his voice sharp and clear. "Helping it is your job." But the veterinarian didn't care. He rolled his eyes and turned back to his computer. "This isn't a charity. I'm telling you, if you don't have money, the door's right there." A man in the waiting room laughed. "Come on, don't you get it? No one's going to help you." 1 second, 2 seconds. Keanu didn't say anything. He just took a deep breath. He was silent, but his eyes told stories that words couldn't. They would remember this moment with regret one day. But then, something worse happened. The dog in his arms suddenly began to tremble. Its muscles tightened. Its breathing became erratic. Bruno was having a seizure. Keanu quickly dropped to the floor and gently laid the dog down. "Bruno, hey, hang in there, buddy. Stay with me." But the dog's eyes stared into the void. Thin foam began to form around its mouth. Its body convulsed uncontrollably. This was an epileptic seizure, and Keanu could no longer wait for anything. "Someone help me!" But there was a silence in the clinic. No one moved. No one helped, because to them, he was just a homeless man. But soon, these people would realize that history was being made. Bruno's body suddenly tensed. First, a slight tremor. Then it turned into a violent seizure. His legs jerked uncontrollably, and his breathing became erratic. Keanu quickly dropped to the ground, carefully laying the dog on its side. He placed his hands gently on Bruno's chest, trying to help him breathe rhythmically. But there was nothing he could do. "Bruno, hey, hang in there, buddy. Calm down, okay?" But the dog's gaze had drifted into emptiness. Thin foam began to drip from the corners of his mouth, and his body stiffened more and more. 1 second, 2 seconds. His breathing became more and more irregular. The people in the waiting room watched, holding their breath, but no one moved. Keanu looked up, his gaze locking directly with the veterinarian's. "This dog is having a seizure. If you don't intervene right now, he could die." The veterinarian remained indifferent. He calmly set his coffee down on the counter, rolled his eyes. Then, crossing his arms, he looked at Keanu with contempt. "How many times do I have to say it? There's a rule here. Pay first, then treatment." Keanu's brows furrowed. A few people in the waiting room began whispering to each other, but none of them moved. One man leaned forward and muttered to himself, "That dog won't live much longer." A woman whispered quietly, "I think we should call the police. This man looks dangerous." Keanu turned his head to them. A brief silence filled the room. Then he looked back at Bruno. The tremors weren't stopping. His eyes were slowly closing, his breathing shallow. Keanu clenched his teeth. Inside, a volcano was ready to erupt, but he kept it under control. Couldn't they see this animal needed help? Why wasn't anyone moving? Bruno's shaking stopped for a moment. Then, his body stiffened again. Keanu's breath caught. The veterinarian smiled. "What did I tell you?" he muttered sarcastically. "You're wasting your time." Keanu Reeves's gaze turned cold, but he didn't show his anger. He took a deep breath. Then, slowly, he stood up. The middle-aged woman who had been silently watching from her seat suddenly jumped to her feet. Her eyes were blazing. "That's enough. If you won't help, I will." All eyes turned to her. The woman quickly turned to Keanu. "There's another clinic nearby. I can take you there," she said in a determined voice. Keanu hesitated for a moment. Then, with a look of gratitude, he immediately scooped Bruno into his arms. "Thank you. Let's go right now." The woman swiftly headed toward the door, and Keanu followed her. But just as they were about to leave, the veterinarian's voice echoed from behind. "You're wasting your time. That dog won't live much longer." Keanu paused for a moment. Had he really said that? Slowly, he turned his head. His eyes were cold. He didn't say a word, because words were no longer needed. He would settle this in a different way. Keanu Reeves tightly held Bruno in his arms and quickly headed toward the door. Time was running out. But just then, the cold, indifferent voice from behind made him stop. "You're wasting your time. That dog won't live much longer." Keanu's steps suddenly froze. Had this man really said that? Slowly, he turned his head, his eyes locking with the veterinarian's, but he didn't say a word, because, for him, this fight wasn't going to end here. "Hurry, let's go," the middle-aged woman called out. Despite the anger building inside him, Keanu quickly moved outside to get Bruno safely to the new clinic. The woman's car was an old but sturdy family vehicle. She opened the back door, and Keanu carefully placed Bruno inside. "He'll be okay, right?" The woman couldn't hide the concern in her voice as she glanced at Bruno's trembling body. Keanu took a deep breath. He'll man it. He has to. The woman quickly took the wheel and started the engine. The car jolted as it began to move. Along the way, Bruno's shaking seemed to subside, but his breathing was still irregular. Keanu gently petted the dog's head with one hand. "Hang in there, buddy. Almost there." As the car sped down the road, the woman glanced at Keanu in the rearview mirror. Unable to hold back, she finally asked, "Is this dog yours?" Keanu shook his head slightly. "Actually, no. He's a rescue dog from the shelter, but tonight, I couldn't leave him." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She realized this wasn't just about a dog. There was a moment of silence. Then, the woman looked at Keanu once more in the mirror, her eyes widening. "Wait a minute. Are you Keanu Reeves?" The woman looked at Keanu in the rearview mirror, her eyes wide with disbelief. Are you Keanu Reeves?" Keanu paused for a moment. There were more important things at that moment. But the woman held her breath. She was now studying his face more carefully. "My God, is it really you? I mean, the Keanu Reeves?" Keanu nodded slightly, but his eyes were still on Bruno. The woman, in shock, gripped the steering wheel. "I didn't want to say this, but at first I thought you looked a little messy, and I guess I judged you." Keanu sighed. "I haven't met anyone who doesn't." The woman turned her eyes back to the road, but her expression had changed. He wasn't just a man with a dog anymore. She was driving next to a genuinely good person, and she couldn't help but wonder how people could be so blind. 10 minutes later, the car finally stopped in front of a small but modern veterinary clinic. Keanu wasted no time, opened the door, gently lifted Bruno into his arms, and rushed inside. As he stepped through the door, the receptionist looked up and her eyes went wide. "Oh, my God, Mr. Reeves." In that moment, everyone in the clinic turned their heads. Suddenly, everything changed. Just a few minutes ago, people had turned their backs on him. But now, everyone was gathering around him. The veterinary technician rushed forward. "What happened? Is your dog sick?" Keanu froze for a brief moment at those words. His dog? That simple sentence made something in his heart ache, because Keanu had already taken Bruno in like his own dog. But there was no time to speak now. "What matters now is not who I am," he said in a firm voice. "Save him!" The veterinarian glanced at Bruno and quickly called for him to be brought inside. Bruno was placed on a stretcher. The doors closed, and for the first time, Keanu felt helpless. He had to wait without knowing whether Bruno would make it or not. When the doors closed, Keanu Reeves took a deep breath and leaned against the wall. There was a weight inside him. It felt as if he had fought the whole world to get to this clinic, but now the only thing he could do was wait. After Bruno was taken inside, time seemed to slow down. Keanu's eyes were fixed on one point. Tonight, he had done everything he could to save that little life. But now, he didn't know what fate would bring. A few people in the waiting area were still staring at him. Some were whispering excitedly. Others watched him in amazement. Even the receptionist had briefly drifted into a daze. The woman was still standing next to him. "Don't worry," she said in a soft voice. "The vet here is very good. Bruno is in good hands." Keanu looked up and glanced at her for a moment. There was fatigue in his eyes, but there was also something else, a deeper emotion. "Do you know," he said quietly, "today I saw just how cruel people can be." The woman sighed. "Yes, but you also saw how good people can be, right?" Keanu thought for a moment. The veterinarian's condescending looks, the mocking words of the people in the waiting room, no one taking a step. But then, this woman's help, her compassion for an animal she didn't even know, the effort she put in to save Bruno. Yes, there were still good people in the world. "Yes," he said finally, "but they're very few." The woman smiled gently. "But sometimes being few is enough." Their conversation was interrupted by a brief silence. Just then, the door opened, and a veterinary assistant entered. His white coat was slightly wrinkled, and his face showed signs of weariness, yet there was a warm and sincere expression on it. "Mr. Reeves?" Keanu immediately stood up. "We need to talk about Bruno's condition, by his full name." Keanu's heart started to race. "What happened? Is he okay?" The assistant took a deep breath and then slowly shook his head. "The seizures are under control for now, but... Keanu's heart sank. But what? A moment of silence passed. It seemed like everyone in the waiting room was affected by what they'd just heard. Finally, the assistant raised his eyes and continued. "He can't be left alone. He needs regular medication and frequent checkups. But most importantly, he needs a safe and loving home." Keanu Reeves paused for a moment. Then he lifted his head and asked, without hesitation, "What do I need to do?" The assistant paused briefly, then smiled lightly. "If you're willing, someone should adopt Bruno. Someone who will meet his needs and truly take care of him." Keanu Reeves smiled gently. "I'll take him." Keanu Reeves's voice echoed in the room. "I accept." These two words changed everything. The veterinary assistant hesitated for a moment. Standing in front of him was one of the world's most famous actors. But in that moment, Keanu Reeves was more than just a movie star. He was a man trying to save a life. The assistant nodded slightly. "This is great news, but you should know, Bruno is a dog that requires special care. Not only does he have epileptic seizures, but his immune system is also weak. He needs regular medication and should be kept away from stressful environments." Keanu looked at Bruno's limp body on the treatment table. In that tiny body, a massive battle was being fought. "It's not a problem for me," he said with a firm voice. "I'll do whatever it takes." The woman turned to Keanu and smiled. "I think Bruno is really safe now." But there was a problem. The assistant grew serious. "Mr. Reeves, The adoption process requires some paperwork. Also, you should consider the clinic's expenses. Epilepsy treatment is not cheap. Keanu smiled lightly. Don't worry. Don't even think about the costs. The woman raised her eyebrows. You must be joking. When you came in, no one trusted you. Even the vet earlier thought you didn't have any money and kicked you out of the clinic. Keanu paused for a moment. Yes, the world worked that way. Appearance often determined who people thought you were. But what truly mattered was what you did. In this world, people often judge based on appearances, he said quietly. But what matters is who you really are. The veterinary assistant and the woman looked at Keanu with a different perspective. He was no longer just an actor. He was a warrior willing to risk everything to save a life. The assistant took a deep breath and pulled out the paperwork. I'll need to keep you waiting for a bit. I need to prepare the adoption forms. Keanu nodded. I'll wait. This night has already lasted long enough. Meanwhile, Bruno let out a faint whimper. His eyes were starting to open. Keanu quickly bent down and placed his hand on the dog's head. Hey, buddy. I'm here. I'll never leave you. Bruno's tail twitched slightly. And in that moment, something changed inside Keanu Reeves. Bruno was no longer just a dog. He was part of Keanu's family. As Keanu Reeves walked toward the clinic's door with Bruno, the silence spoke volumes. The veterinarian, sitting in his place, was watching Keanu. He had pointed him to the door, dismissed his cry for help, mocked him. But now, he had learned that the person standing before him was one of the biggest stars in the world. Before opening the door, Keanu stopped, turned one last time, and looked at the veterinarian. Apologizing doesn't change anything. If we had really lost Bruno tonight, your apology would have meant nothing. The veterinarian averted his eyes. He knew that. The people in the waiting room were sitting still, realizing who the man they had just belittled really was, embarrassed by their previous judgments. Keanu Reeves gave a slight nod. In this world, kindness doesn't have to be free, but mercy shouldn't come with a price tag. Then, he silently turned and walked out of the clinic with Bruno. 1 week later. The sunlight was shining on Keanu Reeves' expansive garden. Beside him was Bruno, now safe. The dog was still in the process of recovering, but he was no longer alone. Keanu looked at him with love, placed his hand on his head and stroked his fur. I promised you, buddy. I'll never leave you. Bruno wagged his tail and snuggled close to him. Keanu Reeves sighed, lifting his head to the sky. He would never forget that night, but most importantly, this event would leave a mark not just on him, but on everyone who witnessed it. Because people should never judge others by their appearance, and most importantly, mercy couldn't be bought with money.